it's a systematic change that has happened from the time of colonialism, I would say that, or from the time whereby Africans were removed from their system of thinking, from their system of living. We're talking of ways whereby everything is not interpreted into our African languages.
Yeah.
So we have an aspect whereby for years, this culture that we have, Africanism basically, and a way of doing things, the way of our ancestors doing things, was seen as backward. We need probably a different mirror to see ourselves as Africans and the culture, not seeing everything from where we come from as negative.
Yeah.
And because I was listening to you speak, and it's that whole thing of like, why are we fragile with this? Why are we scared of, we have all these sets of knowledge, but we are scared of in terms of experimenting with it. Probably it's because of this whole system and systematic, and we also need a systematic change in terms of mind shift.
Yeah, and I think you take me back to obviously some of the things that we are doing obviously in the work on the Barotse floodplain. But I think it all starts, like you said, it's very systematic. It's systematic, but it also follows a path dependence in terms of, for a very long time, I think in terms of our ability to be involved and to contribute to thought has been very negative. And ironically, many of the things that were produced and revealed by our own, for example, our forefathers, currently they are now being sort of, wait, actually it's good. We need to bring it back. Of course, I think there are many examples of that. So I think maybe the space where we're at is I think it all starts with some of the things that we're chatting about in our earlier conversation. How do communities understand their environment, and how can we document that and trust it and actually say, okay, this is valid knowledge to inform practice. I'll give you an example. The other day we were trying to design a fisheries survey, and we struggled a bit in trying to link, for example, the scientific names with the Slozi names. Obviously we're speaking two different languages, obviously, because one is in Latin and the other one is in Slozi. So, but I think it's about also trying to appreciate, even in formal documents, that there is all these Lozi names, and there's a system, there's a nomenclature around it, around the language that actually can give you certain indications of how the system functions. So, for example, a very interesting point, and this is something that the other day with a research that we're doing, we later learned that, for example, certain fish like the tiger fish in Slozi is called Ngweshi. There's another fish that is called Sio and Mulumesi. These are only fish, for example, and the people told us to say, listen, these fish are only found in the main river systems because they're predating on other smaller fish. So, and we were thinking to say, okay, these three fish are found everywhere. But when you try to understand it and speak to these people, you then have a lot to learn.
Politics.
Yeah.
Yesterday, something you said something interesting. You said there's no way people can conserve the environment on an empty stomach. And it's very true. Now, we're talking about all this bringing back Africanism, but we can't conserve on a hungry stomach. But then what changes also needs to actually happen politically?
It's a very tough question, to be honest. But I think, and I think from a science perspective, it's been widely appreciated that that natural resources are highly contested issues, or contested, whether it be at the local level, or whether it be, for example, at the national or even the regional level. There are several competing needs or demands on natural resources. And therefore, because of that competition or that sort of demand, you're bound to have tensions, whether it be different sectors or, for example, even different societies. But maybe to answer your question on we can't conserve resources on an empty stomach, but I think it's really about understanding the economics of resource use. And again, I think it goes back again to my earlier argument about how we've been taught or taken the frame of decoupling the economics and the conservation aspect of it. For a very long time, I think the two, even now, I think the two are running very much parallel. In a sense of, for example, how Africans utilize a resource and how the economics of that resource are plowed back into the management of it. So for a very long time, I think as Africans, we've been more of that pool of resources that is then benefiting, for example, I think other societies, whether it be, for example, timber, whether it be, for example, minerals, and I think the value chain of our resource use is not adequately then sort of looking at, I think, at the management. And I think when you look at, for example, the challenges that communities face in terms of their ability to conserve and their ability, for example, to think about their own development, I think it's really about understanding that you can only manage a resource when you've got power over the economic benefit that accrues from that resource. So in Zambia, and I think there's this whole sort of the pathway to decentralization. It starts, for example, participation, it then goes to authority, and then the final one is fiscal decentralization, whereby, for example, you have power and authority over the economics of that resource use. Unfortunately, many of our societies, even in Zambia and in the region, we've only reached a point where communities are mostly involved or participating. But in terms of the authority of the economics of it, we don't have much power of it. We don't, whether it be, for example, mining, how much power do the communities, the traditional leaders have over the monies that are generated from that mines? Whether, for example, it's on logs that are exported to faraway countries, and to the extent that the community can adequately benefit from the revenue that accrues from that, it's not proportional. And I think it's a challenge. It's a challenge in the sense of how can communities, or even as Africans, how can we start to create economic relations with one another, such that we then try to say, okay, listen, you need to benefit, I need to benefit, we need to conserve, and how can we equitably share the revenue from this, rather than having a 20% remaining and 80% going to other places.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because actually, when you're talking about that whole issues of communities benefiting, that's the reason why we see a lot of conflict in terms of resource management. Because when communities feel like the government or the government, a foreign investor, or through the government, or the government is exploiting a resource, say for example like the Barotse, but we are not benefiting in any way, we are still left, our children have no food to eat or school fees and everything, what happens? Yeah,
and I think many research, for example, even the researcher, many researchers around this what's called the Insaka Consortium have written a lot on benefit sharing. So you find that there are several types of benefit sharing mechanisms. Either it's guided by, for example, market-based benefit sharing mechanism, whereby you let the market dictate how, for example, who benefits more. And unfortunately, within this market-based economics, Africans stand to lose, because I think the economics setup of the system is, unfortunately, because of those systematic issues we spoke about, does not really favor. Then there are other ones of maybe, for example, egalitarian, whereby you look at issues of equity, for example, and you say, okay, I think we need to put a benefit sharing mechanism that I think that benefits more. And I think this even goes back to the point of this podcast. How can we introduce Africanism, African points of seeing how benefits can be shared? That Ubuntu, that communal sharing and equity aspect in terms of how we manage and utilize the economics of resources. Currently, unfortunately, whether it be on mining royalties, on revenues from mines, revenues from forest logging, unfortunately, communities are only getting a small proportion of the entire value chain. because we're not really integrating these other perspectives.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what causes confusion.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And the whole aspect of governance and everything, thinking about the transboundary nature of resources that we have within the sub-Saharan African continent, basically. When you look at the entire Zambezi and how many countries, 8 riparian countries that are specifically, you know, responsible or benefiting in one way or another from this resource. That's the reason why, for me, I feel like the mind shift is required also from the toppest levels of governance in terms of ensuring that the policies we are coming up with, you know, are homegrown. And in terms, and that's how, if we own up the knowledge we have, that's how I think we can also be able in terms of involving these communities. And conservation or protecting this resource would be geared in terms of ensuring that that Ubuntu, that sharing, that common use of a resources that are naturally given to us by God, basically. And that's why the whole issue of capitalism, well, there's good and bad.
Yeah, it's good and bad, that's true.
But then that whole aspect of understanding that we need to exploit, but also need to make sure that we take care of this environment. It's the benefit is, you know, that benefit mutual responsibility between. But then again, for us to take so much time, actually, one of the things that I keep thinking about is that financing aspect.
Yeah, very true.
We keep going to the West from day 1, day 20, and personally, I believe strongly that the West cannot and will not be the solution for Africa. And you talked about something that was very interesting in terms of giving back and actually making sure that whatever is happening, like if it's mining, it's actually giving back, recycling back this money back into this ecosystem and making sure, because that way in terms of conservation, we could be able to generate monies by which we can be able to conserve and to protect our ecosystems and to benefit from them. Let's speak about financing aspect and why African leadership needs to stop looking at the West and realize we have a lot of mineral resources, but one of the things you'll actually agree with me is that the contracts.
I mean, I'll give you back to, I think one of the things that came out the time, I think we were also looking at one of the issues of management of one of the key aspects around the Barotse floodplain. It was around the canals. So the canals, the Barotse floodplain has got a huge network of canals. And obviously these canals were built by local communities. When they were built, there was this sense that each of an individual community needed either to provide in-kind labor or, for example, food or any resource in terms of how that canal management was done. Obviously, I think post-independence, or I think somewhere there about the ability of communities to actually invest their own resources and time in the management of natural resources became a bit divided. And so they saw it more as the role of the state, the role of others to support the promotion of that natural resources. And I think that maybe began the problem of things. And I think we've already talked about the challenge of how many of the economics now do not maybe plow back into the resource management. There's several initiatives, whether it be, for example, the payment for ecosystem services, the RED Plus. They're trying to recognize how, for example, conservation can be self-sustaining. Unfortunately for now, many of the conservation sector, whether it be in Zambia, of course, in Africa, of course, there are other regions whereby the conservation sector is still highly dependent on grants, on donors that unfortunately come from Europe or the West. And I think that aspect of how communities can plow back in conservation, it's still lagging. Fundraising domestically in Zambia is very difficult. You find that even when you're trying to fundraise for a forest restoration effort, you find that the amount of money you get is still low. And I think it's still because of that thing which I talked about, whereby for a very long time in societies, we haven't really started thinking, remembering that actually it's our resource and we need to plow back. And because of that dependency on other financing elsewhere, it becomes that financing comes packed with certain ideologies or certain solutions that you're supposed to replicate. So you find that the design of conservation and where the financing comes from are linked.
Totally.
And therefore, because we are not financing our own conservation, we can't then sort of start to experiment or start to to think about it. But of course, as I said, there are certain examples, whether it be, for example, the Payment for Ecosystem Services. There are different organizations like WWF, the TNC, who are trying to set up what are called water funds. And these are meant to say the resource users need to generate revenue to plow back in the natural resources, but also understanding, for example, the role that each community plays in the provision of ecosystem services. And I think that's the key. But I think that point, Sophie, the financing and the co-design of the solution and knowledge are linked. And the only way that we as Africans are start now going to influence these conservation interventions is we also start to equally plow and allocate resources towards conservation. And unfortunately, that also leads up into the issues of thought leadership, but also in terms of our involvement as Africans in the conservation space. Many of African countries, the conservation space, as Africans, we don't really dominate it, and I think it's a challenge for us.
And I just want to ask a little bit further in terms of how do we get more involved? How do we get more finance from our own within, our own, from Africa, from domestic? How do we go about it? So
I think it's really about making a proper business case, and I think and I think slowly many players in the private sector are starting to realize that one of the key risks to their business is issues of environmental degradation. If you're not mindful about the issues around environmental risk, it will definitely hammer your business. And if you're looking, for example, to include private sector more in conservation, you need to really unpack that business case such that they start to think that this profit margin that we're getting is actually because of this ecosystem, and therefore in the long run, if we don't address this or don't contribute towards this, it will definitely hit our bottom line. And I think for players like, for example, mining companies, for players, for example, the brewers who depend a lot on water, this business case needs to be made.
And that calls for need-driven research, then investing in need-driven
absolutely.
research.
Absolutely. We need to, and listen, and I think, we've, I think as conservation organization, what maybe we've not done so well is really getting the boardroom with proper research to actually influence what the CEOs actually decide in there. And I think making a case for why environment needs proper financing. And I think that's what even other thought leaders are saying. If you look at, for example, the amount of money that are, for example, allocated to conservation versus the amount of money that are allocated, for example, business growth, it's disproportional. It's the amount of money that you get through grants versus the amount of money that you're going to get, for example, having a company to start maybe invest in sustainable business, these sort of bankable projects. We can't survive in the conservation phase only on philanthropy money. No, we need to make a proper business case and bring in economics back to support conservation.
Thank you so much. I sincerely appreciate you having this conversation with me.
Thank you so much,
And
Sophie.
I think we should have more of these conversations too, because then again, that whole thing of Africa taking control, defining its development. What does development mean for Zambia? What does development mean for Kenya? What does development mean for Sub-Saharan Africa? And I sincerely believe that we cannot become, if we do not protect the ecosystem that protects us, the ecosystem that feeds us, the ecosystem that gives us air, the ecosystem that is very important for our livelihood. Climate change for me is a symptom of a disease that the disease needs to be tackled first before you can tackle the symptoms. I believe it strongly, in the words of Thomas Sankara, that we must accept the African way of life. As the African way of life, it's the only way to live in dignity and in peace. Why? Today we are going back to the foods that in Kenya we call them orphan food. arrowroots, cassava, things like sweet potatoes. You know, we're having issues of maize, we're having issues of diseases that have actually gone high. When you look back at the environment, it's because we're using too much fertilizers, we're using pesticides and all that kind of stuff that is coming back to us. We are overfishing, using blasting methods, and then we eat this fish that is actually affecting us. So at the end of the day, it's that codependence with nature, and it's that ensuring that we protect this particular nature. And so we cannot we have to understand first who we actually are for us to be able to tackle even the resources that we actually have, and to be able to be mindful. Like, if I really understand who I am, and I'm very confident with who I am, I'm able to actually accommodate you, you know, as my neighbor. And that's the reason why it's easy for me to say, you know what, I'm going to take this stream of water and leave the other one for Matara, for him to take. And that oneness, that cohesiveness that happened and that occurred in Africa before. I think it's the whole thing. And maybe we've gone too far, and I'm not sure whether we can come back, but maybe your final word.
Well, just I think to appreciate this, I think the thinking around this topic, because as I said, I think societal norms, beliefs, and frames, the co-production of knowledge, and how we incorporate all this in practice, have an influence in terms of how all three are linked and how we can push for. And I think at all these, I think African thought, African idealism, I think we need to appreciate it and bring it to the fore. And I think podcasts like this, but also maybe interfacing with local communities as well, where I think you try to learn all of these things a bit more. And I think it's such forums like this that I think are critical. Yeah, but so just appreciate for this time, and having it on the flat plain, just at the edge of the Barossa flat plain. It's a wonderful area.
Too bad the sun could not allow us to actually shoot things.
Yeah, but it's really a privilege, and look forward to many more.
Thank you so much. Thanks, I sincerely appreciate. And please do remember to share, to subscribe, and to like this particular podcast. We are Africa Climate Conversations. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much, Matara, for actually joining us today.
Thank you so much, Sophie.
Thank you so much.